So, was there something I was forgetting about? Oh, the rights and that as well. We can do that. Those differ community to community. So if people are from like Ochis, most of our communities do 4 days, a minimum of 4 days. And so if they're done, and in communities, lots of them take place in the home of the family. And if you go in, all of the mirrors and all of the windows are closed. They've got blankets hanging over them, so there's no reflections and stuff happening in the house. People, family especially, and close friends are admonished, you don't cry in front of the person who's deceased. You don't cry there, because your tears will hold them back, will keep them from moving on. And your tears are for yourself, they're not for that person, so they don't cry, you know. And that you cry outside or away, and there's ceremonies for letting go of that because the residential school got demolished, cut out, and so the people gather around, they stay with the body for 4 days when it's brought home. Often it's family members that will wash and clean the body. One of my family members, she died she was HIV positive, and the mortuary wasn't even going to touch her. They didn't want to have to touch her at all. And it was up to my family to make sure that she was cleaned and taken care of properly, because of this contagious. And so usually our they're not embalmed, so the room is kept cool, and they're kept surrounded by people, and people tell stories, and they laugh, and they sing songs, and they let that, you know, they talk about funny things regarding that person, and if they talk about pieces that touch their heart, you know, that's a good thing. They sing the favorite songs of that individual. They sing community healing songs, helping songs, and often it's a mix, so that there are because the Catholic Church especially was so invasive, and yeah, invasive is the only word I can think of that's polite at the moment. But they wanted to teach people about being Catholics, and so many people, their songs are a mix of Catholic hymns and stuff, and then some of the surviving community songs or that they have their own songs of passage and of letting that person go home and of being okay. And it's an honor when we can sing a person home. And that's what it's called, is singing them home on that last journey. And so people eat, they sit around, you know, there's usually a fire burning outside where people can gather around there, and if they're going to cry, they cry there around the fire pit. And there's always food and stuff for people, and everybody comes together to mourn and let that person go, so that they don't hold on to And in some of the communities, it is not unusual to have a funeral or more be done every day for, you know, especially if one person had, if they've got sort of a pact agreement that I can't live if you go, and she goes, and so I go as well, and you go, and you go. And then there's only 3 people left to continue, right? And so in it's hard on the community, and it's like there's no end to the grief, and so it just sort of gets layer on top of layer on top of layer. And many of our communities they don't cry anymore, because if I start crying, when am I going to stop? You know, is there a time I'll be able to stop? And often there's so much that you get numb, and it's there's no other word for it. It's you just get numb, and you have a burial today, and you start a new 4-day week tomorrow. You know, when do you find that? And so I think that's a piece of a lot of our grieving and heaviness in communities. And there used to be, and I know in Halkamelum, one of their, in Chilliwack with the Stolo people, one of their rites of letting go used to be that they lived together in a longhouse during the winter, and so if there were losses and stuff in there, it was taken care of. And then at the end of the longhouse season, when spring came, they would take a sledge, you know, a big sledge they called them, and the people who had lost people, the sledge would be empty to begin with, and they'd start hauling it up the mountainside, and each person that had lost people, they'd put a rock in and another rock in for all the people that they had lost during the year. And by the time the sledge would get to the top of the mountain, it would be filled with rocks, and everybody would be having to help drag that heavy sledge up the mountain and push it up. But when they got to the top, they all took part in letting them all go too. And that was part of their ceremony about letting go and having, you know, they cried and they struggled and used all of their muscles to get it up the hill. And that was their grieving process. And then you get to the top and you release all that, and when you come down, you're lighter. And that a lot of that was stopped for a long time when it was illegal, because up until I think it was 1935, 1950, somewhere in around, if we were all Aboriginal people, we would all go to jail. Because it was illegal for more than 3 adults to be gathered together in any one place for any reason.
Well, it's not really reunions. Nothing.
Yeah, and if you're grieving, you know, how many people do you, if you lose someone, a friend or relative, how many people come to that service? How many people go to the gravesite? More than 3? You will go to jail.
Yeah.
You know, and so when the schools were happening, same thing. 3 people couldn't be, I mean, if someone came and took your children, how many of you would want to get together and protest. Find a way to get your kids back. Well, if there's only 3 of you that can get together and you need a reason for it, that sure stops that. So those kinds of things were, as well, if you look on the reserves and the spread outness of the homes, well, that would stop many people getting together when they're that far apart. And so those pieces got left behind. And when I look at lots of, like parenting, that it used to be parents weren't the only parent, like the biological parent, right? Kids would have their babies early. And yes, the moms would do the nursing, but it wasn't the moms and dads that really did the parenting for a long period of time. It was cookums and aunties that the moms, the young moms and dads, they were doing the heavy work, the skinning, the tanning, the hunting that it took to keep a community going. So the older people who had less energy or maybe less strength, they took care of the camps. They took care of the cooking. They took care of the kids while mom did the heavy work. Not that they replaced her as parent, but they did the discipline. And if you think about yourself and your own families, you know, how many of you were told to do the dishes as a kid, or sweep the floor, or you know, do any of those chores? And if it was mom that was telling you, there was always and people were, you know, cranky about the whole thing. And mom would have to get after you and after you or whatever. Guys for cleaning the garage or doing whatever things guys do. But if it was auntie that said, well, it's time to do the dishes, my girl, there was no resistance. It was something you did with auntie. And if kids were being obnoxious and interrupting and stuff, they were often ignored. Not because they were ignored, but their behavior was being ignored. And after a little while, auntie would come and take, you know, or Cookham would come and take the child away and tell them how come they were being ignored, you know, and teach them that it's not okay to do that this is, and they teach them in a story about proper behavior and give them cues or ideas as to what could be done to put them back in good graces. But there was no fighting, no power struggle with mom and dad that way. And so when kids went to residential school, what they remembered was mom never said no. Mom never gave me trouble. Mom never disciplined, right? Because Cookham and auntie weren't really disciplined. And when they got into the schools, the discipline was very harsh and very prolonged often. And so kids, I'm never going to tell my kids no. I'm going to be like my mom. She never said no. I'm not going to, you know, tell my kids, correct them, because that was hurtful. But there wasn't that. They forgot that auntie wasn't there. And so what we wound up with was, any of you ever seen a milk stool? You know, they got those 3 legs in there and the seat. Well, we wound up with a milk stool with only 1 leg. The fact that mom never said no. They forgot about the aunties that would take you in and let you know in a kind way what you had done wrong and what you could do to fix the situation. And the expectation that everybody took part in the community. Everybody, whether you were old or young, that there was a place for you. And there wasn't after that. And so what you guys see a lot of is young people, maybe not so young, that learn those habits without ever knowing the other side. You know, and so we've got lots of kids that know they have the right to not be beat anymore, but they've never learned about the responsibilities that go along with that. And things that I used to work at Hull Home, and we had a young boy that came down from northern Alberta, and he was from a very small community. And when he came into Hull Home, he was charged, you know, within his cottage for stealing on frequent occasions. He'd take somebody's coat, he'd take pens or pencils or things like that. And I never stole anything. And they you got the coat on your back. What do you mean you never stole it? You know, or you've got the pen right in your desk. Well, yeah, I never stole it though. And in his community, if you had 2 jackets and you were only wearing one, and she didn't have a coat and needed one, it was perfectly valid for her to take your coat, wear it, and then give it back to you. It wasn't considered stealing. She didn't have something you had 2 of. And he never thought about that as being stealing. And the staff in his cottage never thought about it as anything other than, of course you're stealing, and not only are you stealing, you're lying to me right in the face. And so he was constantly in trouble until I said, well, yeah, but his community values, he's not stealing. You know, in his community, it's okay because you're going to give it back. You know where your coat is, you can see it. And those values and cultural things often get our guys in trouble when they come. And if their parents were involved in drugs or alcohol, and many of the guys that go into corrections are fetal alcohol to some degree or another, they don't want bad things to happen, but they don't equate what they're doing. You know, yeah, I took your phone, but I didn't want you to be upset. So they really have that missing piece in there. And one of the boys I worked with, he was always, if not in jail, on the verge of jail or some form of discipline. And he said, you know, Ray, it's like when I wake up in the morning, I know I'm going to get in trouble. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what it is I do wrong. But he said it's like if you put eggs in front of me and I have to walk on them, I know I can never make it to the other side of the room without breaking eggs. And I don't know how come. You know, and he said, every day they're different eggs, but I'm still going to break them. And it was such a sad look on his face because he really didn't intend to offend people. But he knew he was going to break some rule or egg at some point during the day. It was just a matter of when, not if. And that comes from a lot of our gaps anymore in parenting, because when our kids went into residential school, they did learn parenting. And so when they came out, they used those parenting skills the same as we learned parenting. The difference was that they learned parenting from an institutionalized point of view. without caring, without hugs, without any of that piece. Have a roof over your head, a bed to sleep in, some sort of food on the table. And that's parenting. And from an institutional perspective, that's true. There was no room for hugs. And if you look at some of our families, moms are very caring and huggy of their kids and interactive with them until they get to about that high. And then moms really don't know, and dads don't know, how to hug their kids. They don't know. And if you never have, it's the saddest thing to watch a mom when her kid's coming up to give her a hug and she brings her arms in and puts her hands like this. You know, it's like a barrier to that kid. And she just squishes herself in. Because when those kids came out of residential school, being hugged, being touched by an adult was not a safe, kind, or nurturing thing most of the time. That the hurts were either physical or emotional, spiritual, mental. They were all damaged. And when we have senators that go on the news and say, well, there were good things that came out of residential school, you know, that I just want to slap people. Because that's like saying there were good things that came out of the Holocaust. You know, that not everybody died. That's a good thing. You know, yeah, you're tattooed for life, whether with a number, whether you want it or not. Yeah, you have memories of horrors that nobody should have. There were good things. So the burial rites, people do stay together. And in some places they'll walk the person so that they'll carry the bier for the person, or they'll have it drawn by a horse and buggy. And everybody walks to the gravesite and puts that person to rest. And they walk around the gravesite in a circle. Often sweetgrass will be placed in there. But once they leave, they walk and they never look back. You don't look back to the person. Because doing that, you keep the person tied to you. And that's seen as, it's selfish, right? You're keeping their spirit here for your own support. And that's not okay. It's not that you're not loving or caring. That, and there, different people do different ceremonies at the gravesite. Usually items that were significant to that person are placed in the grave with them.
Like moccasins, like they get them, like sometimes I've heard they get a new pair of moccasins for their journey, or they'll wrap them in like a star blanket or something like that.
Or if they have significant, can I share? When when my niece passed, we had her services, and she had been given a cloak by the Maori people where she did one of her practicums, and that went in with her, and significant gifts that had been given to her. Her sons and her husband. It was a good thing they went with her. And so those happened. And those are individualized as to what's important to that person. Because she'll need them on the other side. Her Metis sash, a new sash went with her, that sort of thing. Then, to begin with, it's her immediate family that cover her, right? And that work is being done on her behalf. And then it's only when there's a covering over that community people come and help as well. Right. So, I'd asked you, besides Indians, what other Aboriginal groups are there in Canada? Metis, Inuit.
Or say Mohawk.
That's a band.
No.
Yeah. So there's Indians, or the new term. Nope. Oh, I get to draw
Inuit.
No,
No, that's an Inuit.
So,
Yeah.
You get to see a Venn diagram.
so
First
this
Nation.
term was the old one. And underneath there were Indians and half-breeds. And Eskimos. That's what the original term is, right? This term Indian has been replaced because it was deemed inappropriate. And Aboriginal became the appropriate word. Underneath that was First Nations, Inuit, and Metis. So if you use the term Aboriginal, you are meaning all three of those. So it's inappropriate to go Aboriginal and Metis, or Aboriginal and Inuit. It's like saying,
Pin number. Pin number.
yeah. It's like saying you've got, you're all women and you're females. It's, And so now that term Aboriginal has got a new term, Indigenous. And some of us like that, and some of us do not, because one of the things it's given rise to is that we need to indigenize things. Well, that does sound better than we need to Aboriginalize things or Indianize things, but it's also nonsensical, because you can't. Indigenize means to make something indigenous, and indigenous means the original trees and the original rocks and stuff. So this was to be all Aboriginal peoples across the world. So in New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Mexico, Peru, North America, that they all had Aboriginal people on the land. This term Indigenous came to mean all of them. And so I work with a couple of national groups and elders and stuff, and about 50-50 are split as to whether this is appropriate or this. Everybody agrees like this was the original word. Well, no, I mean, like I don't have a problem with that word, right? We didn't make it a dirty word. European people did. You know, they attached it in that we were second class from the treaties on down. It's like half-breed. I have friends that call me a half-breed with love and affection and respect. I have people who have called me Metis as if it were something they wanted to scrape off their shoe. Yeah. You know, it's how you say it and what you mean from it, right? As far as I'm concerned. And Métis is just a French word for half-breed, mixed blood. Really, it doesn't, you know, it's just become more socially acceptable to use that word for Métis people. Our term used to be Otapimaswak, and it means the free people, the independent people. And I much prefer that label or that term. And the reason it was given to us, and it was from Cree people, was because Métis people could fight on behalf of Cree people or on behalf of Blackfoot people at their own discretion, or they could not fight at all, or they could side with mainstream people, or not at all. But I prefer that word to all of the others. But the three groups of us are these, and we're all included anymore under the Indian Act. That, which is what the Daniels did, is that it affirmed, because about almost 20 years ago, a man named Harry Daniels, he said, are we Indians under the Indian Act or are we not? And he put that question to the courts, and it took 16 years to get a decision at each level of the courts. Each time it was resolved, it got taken back to go to a higher court until it went to the Supreme Court. And they said, yeah, you are Indians under the Indian Act. And what it resolved was, if you're not under the Indian Act, which is a federal jurisdiction, then you're under provincial. And so for Métis people, if we had a question that needed, you know, a problem around healthcare or education or housing or anything, and you go and you knock on the provincial door, they go, no, you're Indians, that's a federal thing. So you're knocking on the wrong place. And you'd go to the federal government and you'd knock on their door. No, you're not Indian under the, you got to go to the provincial door. And it was like hot potato back and forth. Nobody wanted to take responsibility, not for child welfare, not for housing, not for anything. And so the Daniels decision answered once and for all, Métis people, the federal government has a fiduciary responsibility for us. Not that we have to live on reserves, not that we have to, and so now there's a lot of negotiation and discussions and agreements that are being worked out at a national level between Trudeau and our leaders, MNC. That will probably go on for quite some time. But it is having effects for Métis people that will continue growing and increasing over time. Some people are happy about it, others not, because originally it was like, okay, we all get free cigarettes or cheap cigarettes and gas, right? And well, no, that isn't what that's all about. So 100% of treaty Indians are status. How come only 50% are treaty status? And the answer is, you can have status, non-status, treaty, non-treaty. Status means, used to mean, you were on the Indian list, that your name was listed. And when Indian agents used to go around to communities back in the day, they often went to communities when the guys were out hunting. And so the only way that this young lady or any of you would have your name on the status list was if your husband or your father were there, because status became attached to the man under the colonial idea of who was important. So if your name wasn't on the list, you were a non-status person, but you weren't on the treaty. Somebody who is treaty lives in a community, a band, a nation that has signed treaty 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, 7 or 8. And now there are some accords in British Columbia. But you could be status, meaning that you were on the Indian list, and live in a community that never signed a treaty. So you could be status and non-treaty. You could be treaty, living on a reserve that signed a treaty, but have never been put on the status list. You could also be non-status and non-treaty, or status and non-treaty, non-status and treaty. That was the government solution. And in about, I think it was 1956, 1960, they decided that if you were treaty, you were status. So they sort of put those together. And the other piece of being treaty meant that you got treaty rights. And so treaty rights are, you get an annual payment, and depending upon what's in your treaty, you used to get an X amount of dollars. You got a blanket, you got a bag of sugar, and you either got a piece of equipment or bag of seed for agriculture, stuff like that. Well, or you got a rifle or a musket with shot, right? They stopped doing the muskets and shot or rifle and bullets. They don't hand out the bag of seeds. They don't hand out the flour and sugar, and they don't hand out the blankets anymore. They do still give treaty payments as long as you line up for them on treaty days. So the chief, depending upon what's in the treaty, gets around $20. A counselor gets 12 to 15, depending again on the treaty. And then a member gets $2 to $5 per year. And you have to line up for that. And those amounts have never, ever changed. Even though those treaties are over 100 years old, and the value of $2 is nowhere near what it was before, that is still what you, that is the treaty payment. So this idea that being treaty means you get hundreds of thousands of dollars is brown sugar.
Yeah.
Where there were increased payments, such as Louisville and Sampson, they used to have large payments every year for them. Those were from resources though. The same as if you had an oil well or several of them on your land, every year the government or the company would give you royalties for having that there. Mineral rights, yeah. Well, for Aboriginal people, they went to the band, to the individual adults on a yearly basis. But for kids, the federal government was the trustee for those children. And so every year the money went to the federal government and they kept it in trust for the kids. So it could go $50,000, $80,000, whatever it was that they were getting. They got that in one lump payment the day they turned 18. You guys have all been 18. Who would have been like if somebody, the day you were celebrating your 18th birthday, somebody gave you a check for $80,000? Exactly, yeah. Especially when you had never been raised in a culture around saving or having monetary plans. Because one of the reasons under the Indian Act to stop being an Indian, to be removed, was that you had a bank account with more than $3 in it. Up until 1953 or 56 when they revised it. If you had more than $3 in your bank account, you didn't need the protection of being an Indian anymore. So you lost your Indian status. If you had more than an elementary school education, you lost your Indian status. If you were a white woman, if you were a white woman and you married an Indian man, you automatically became Indian by virtue of the magic wand. If you were an Indian woman and you married a white man, you automatically lost your Indian status by virtue of the magic wand. The other term for magic wand is a penis. That was the only difference. And so they've changed that law in, it was 1984, that it changed so that if a white woman marries a status man, she does not gain status. If a status woman marries a white person, she does not lose status. But the belief and the value, like the fear of, okay, I can't get married because I won't have a home and I won't be who I am anymore, has continued in many, many homes. So women will have a relationship with a Metis or non-status person, but they won't, or a white person, but they won't get married to them. Because that old piece, right? It took a long time to get there. It takes a long time to go away. But so there are about 50% that are, but they changed that because it was really cumbersome, and so they look at all treaty people now as being status. Not all status people though are treaty, and so if they're not treaty, they don't get to line up for their $5 or $2, which is heartbreaking. So on North America, where is our historic homeland? It starts at the Ontario-Manitoba border, and it comes to the BC-Alberta border, and that is what's known as the historic Métis homeland. Covers that space. That's where we came to. And so for people to qualify for as Métis citizens, so citizens of the Métis Nation of Canada, Métis Nation of Alberta, we have to be able to trace our history, not, some people think back to Red River, and that isn't what it is. It's we have to be able to trace our history back to pre-colonial control. So back to when there wasn't control established, so about 1857 or thereabouts was when the colonial government took control. And we have to be able to trace our families back to that in order to be able to maintain that we are Métis people. And you have to be acknowledged by your Métis community, and that you self-identify as a Métis person. And it's not always in our, or hasn't always been in our best interest, because if you go to the hospital or you go to court in Metasquin or Panoka or Rocky, even the hospital here in Red Deer, and you say, yes, I'm a Métis person, your health care can go down to next to nil, maybe a little above nil. May get treatment better than someone who's living on the streets, but not a whole bunch. And if you don't believe me, go try it. And if you're in court in Metasquin or Panoka or Rocky, and you're in there for an infraction, even in Red Deer, identify as an Aboriginal person and see how different your sentence is than if you are white. But they do say justice is blind. So, the answer to which category of Indians is known as First Nations are those who can trace their community or their heritage, their nation, back to pre-contact. So Halkamelan, Cree, Blackfoot, Mi'kmaq, otherwise known as Mohawk, the Anishinaabe, those are First Nations people, and they were here pre-contact. Métis didn't come pre-contact because we were a blend of two nations, mainstream and First Nations. And what I was taught about being a Métis or half-breed from my dad was we're not less than one or the other, that we're the bridge, a link between two nations. And we can either be the best bridge that we can be and transfer the best of the cultures from one to the other, or we can be the worst and share the worst of our cultures. Because there are bad things, negative things about white people, and there are negative things about Aboriginal people. But it's our choice as to which way we want to share that, right? And when I used to complain about being that, I wanted to be one or the other when I was a kid. I didn't care which, but I wanted to be one or the other. That was his answer to me. You are a bridge, and that's what you're going to be for all of your life. So sort of suck it up, baby. That's. I loved your mom. I married her, and you are the result.
Right. Just a quick question.
Sure.
If we're talking about First Nations as people who were here before, like pre-contact, what distinguishes them between First Nations and Inuit, other than where?
Location.
Other than location, what's the difference?
Inuit people
Yeah.
used to be called Eskimos,
Right.
but they live above the they
Right.
live in the north, and that's all.
So
Like
would they?
very different. They didn't come under the Indian Act originally because nobody knew they were there.
Right.
I mean,
So they then, would that still be a considered a First Nation then?
No, they are,
They're
Inuit
distinct.
people are very, very clear in that they are a distinct nation.
Okay.
They, at national level, they, that they are the distinct peoples. They are Inuit people. They are not First Nations.
Okay.
And they're very clear about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the Indian Act does now include all of us. And that was one of the reasons for the Daniels, because there were areas where half-breeds were included in the Indian Act, and there were areas where they were not.
Mm-hmm.
And there are treaties where they were included and treaties where, but yeah, I think in almost every treaty that's been signed, Métis people were signatories to it. To the treaties, 6 and 7, and I think 8 for sure. And those treaties begin on the eastern side of Saskatchewan and come west. Bill C-31, which is an interesting thing. I think that was 19, what did I put? 1985, I think, is when they were first acknowledged. And it came because 4 Mi'kmaq women took the government to court and to the United Nations, and they protested the removal of their status, their right to be Indian women, treaty women, status women, to the court based solely on the fact that they were women who had married white men. And that was when they changed the law that said that if a white woman married an Indian man, she became Indian, and if an Indian woman married a white person or non-status, she became a non-Indian. That Bill C-31 was the government's intention to fix that. But what it did was, if you had been married in 1983 and the lady had lost her status and she went to court after the decision in 1984 and got it back, she only came back as a half Indian. So she never got back full status. And in 3 generations, the status was removed completely. And then they did another court appeal, and it became, I think it was called Bill C-41, which allowed 4 generations down, but it still removed the status from people. So, and that was not a logical, and is not a logical device, in my opinion, because it's left this thing, and the only reason that people lost their status was, as I said, because of who they had sex with. Well, in my case, I could legally, if I allowed my husband to, be identified as a status person. However, under the way they've constructed it, I will be full status. Because when I was 18, and I knew it all, I knew all about life at 18, I got married to an Aboriginal man who was non-status. And by the time I was 24, I realized that this was a mistake. Oops, that meant that my dad was right, or I was not quite right. Not that I was willing to say I was, the other word, but he was more writer than I was. And so I terminated that marriage. And I got remarried to another Aboriginal man whose dad had lost his status because he went to war. And carrying a weapon off reserve was a reason to lose your status. I forgot to say that. And so when we got married before 1984. So when he got his status back, under the eyes of the government, from my first marriage, I had become a half Indian, plus being married a second time. A half and a half equal a whole. If you have half a cup and half a cup, you get a whole cup. That being said, I would have had, under the Indian Act law, more complete status than my dad or either of my in-laws who were First Nations.
Bureaucracy is fun.
Isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
And so when my sister-in-law was encouraging me to let my husband do that, I said, Rosie, the only reason I would be entitled to status and being a band member, because the band was willing to accept me, I said, was because I had legal sex with your brother. If we had just got together, nothing would have changed. And she thought that was the funniest thing ever. So, no, we don't qualify, non-status, non-treaty Indians or Métis, we don't qualify for tax exemption. Now, whether that's going to change now that Daniels has come into effect, nobody really knows. You know how those negotiations are going to be, and it's above my pay grade. That's how I look at it. So that's some of the questions that people so Aboriginal rights are things like hunting, fishing, and gathering berries, food, that sort of thing. Those are Aboriginal rights. That we have the right to go hunting, we have the right to go fishing, we have the right to go onto Crown lands and gather sweetgrass or berries or other foods. And there used to be, I think it was almost 1,000 First Nation groups in Canada. There are now only about 640. The others were extinguished for one reason or another. Here in Alberta, there were several that were extinguished. And only about 20 of them have achieved what is considered self-government, where they govern themselves. They're working at it. So your question 16 about reserves, that they are legally pieces of land set aside for status Indians to live on. There are about 2,666 of them in Canada. And yes, some of them are about the same size as an average city block, because they started out larger, they got whittled down. If you look at the treaties, there's a really cool piece when they talk about reserves, that this land is yours forever unless the Queen Mother finds a better use for it.
Who decides who's better use for it?
The government.
That's subjective.
Yeah.
No, that's the government, that's that. And so
Yeah.
reserves that stretched for days and days got whittled down because the government found better uses for that land. It's like Metis land. Alberta is the only province in Canada that set aside land specifically for Metis people. And it was called the Metis settlements. And there used to be, I think it was 12. We now, might have been 13. We now have 8. And the reason that they removed 4 large settlements was because when the influx of Ukrainian people came in, and Alberta, Saskatchewan, they wanted them to come in for farming and stuff and agricultural issues. 4 of the settlements were up around Bonnyville, east area, down into, I think almost down to Panoka for some of them. But they were on very good agricultural land. And the Ukrainian settlers that came in wrote to the federal government and said, this land is rich, good agricultural land, and it's too good for half-breeds. We can put it to better use. And so we'd like the government to take it away and give it back, give it to us, because we can deal with it better. And so that's what they did. And the settlements that are still in existence, Peavine, East Peavine, Fishing Lake, Colleen Lake, Paddle Prairie, those communities are where it's rocky, muskegee type land. But they were left in camps. About the number of our children, 150,000 went to residential school. And that would increase if the actual number of Métis children were included in there. Half of them died. They died without their families often being told that they passed. They died from malnourishment. They were used as experiments. And the government and the churches documented taking all dairy products or all meat away from Aboriginal children, see what effect it would have on them. Would it would have an effect like it did on white children? They didn't think it would. Dental care, stuff like that. They did. Canada did some interesting experiences. The last residential school closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. They had changed hands before, where instead of church nuns and priests and that running some of the schools, they were turned over to the band to be run. The problem with that was that the people in the band, the First Nations people that actually ran those schools for about 10 years, were residential school survivors. So the main difference was, instead of children being contained by white people, they were now contained by their own people, right? And abused by their own people in many instances because they learned institutional parenting and institutional care, and that's what they gave their children. And you see that if you look at or talk to any of your clients, that's what they were raised with, was an institutional form of care where there wasn't the affection, there wasn't the physical connection in a good way, because nobody knew how to show it. You think about the kids in your family, and how many of you hug them and cuddle them and give them healthy baths or tuck them into bed and tell stories, because you learned how to do that. If you didn't, you don't know how. A friend of mine, her name's Ronnie, and she talks to me about residential school. And when it first happened, it was devastating to people, to communities, to lose their children, because you could be cooking and you'd look outside and your kids would be gone. And you'd have to go find them, and they used to have them held in cattle pens, and when the children were all gathered from the communities, they'd load them onto cattle cars or trucks or whatever and take them to residential schools. And it wasn't to one school or anything, but it was, okay, I'm at St. Mary's, I need 3 people, and I grabbed the first 3 people off that are in the front or when I open the car door, and I drag them out. They may or may not know each other, preferably not. And I close the door, go on to the next one, and take 3 more, or however many the school needs, and drop them off. And back at that time, if as a parent you wanted to go and visit your kids, you had to apply for the right to officer. You had to ask for permission. How come you want to go? Okay, well, you've got a kid in St. Mary's and a kid somewhere else, and a kid up at Blue Quills, which is north of Edmonton. Which one are you going to go visit? And if you're going to let them come home, you have to go get them. You have to bring them back. And if you don't, I'll put you in jail. You know, and so how do parents make that choice as to which child they'd go and visit? And you had to find out where they were yourself, because the Indian Affairs officer, the RCMP, had no commitment, no need to tell you where your children were. And so many children stayed in those schools for 10 years. And they were often told that their parents were dead, they didn't want them, they'd given them away, all kinds of stories. And if you tell a little kid something as an adult, often enough they'll believe you. So a treaty rate, that's your $5, bag of flour or sugar, and a blanket. Often the blankets were smallpox or otherwise infested. But they don't hand out the blankets anymore. So 3 national organizations.
I misread.
Oh, you know me?
Things like Metis National Council is a national Aboriginal organization, Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, the National Women of Canada, Metis National Women's Council. My mind went blank. There's a health organization, and AFN, Aboriginal They're a political body. Yeah. Not Aboriginal Affairs. Good one, but they're a government organization.